For decades, Danny DeVito has been one of the most instantly recognizable faces in American entertainment, a man whose voice, timing, and sheer stubborn charisma turned him into a leading man despite every industry rule that said he shouldn't be one. He's played villains, con men, hairdressers, and hopeless romantics, and audiences have loved him in every version. But behind the laughter, DeVito's life has been shaped by pain that rarely made it onto the screen, a body that fought him from childhood, a marriage that never quite ended even after it fell apart, and a lifetime spent proving people wrong. Now well into his 80s, the real story of how Danny DeVito lives is far more complicated, and in many ways sadder, than the loud, funny characters he's famous for. Danny DeVito was born in Neptune, New Jersey, the youngest child in a working-class Italian-American family. His father ran a small business in Asbury Park, and by most accounts the household was loving, if modest. But from very early on, Danny stood apart from other kids physically. He grew to a final adult height of just under 5 feet, the result of a rare genetic bone disorder called multiple epiphyseal dysplasia, sometimes referred to as Fairbanks disease. The condition affects how cartilage and bone develop, and for DeVito it meant not only a much shorter stature than his peers, but also joint pain, stiffness, and a heightened risk of arthritis that would follow him for the rest of his life. Being visibly different in a small New Jersey town in the S wasn't easy. DeVito has spoken in interviews about feeling like an outsider as a kid, about being teased, and about the particular kind of self-consciousness that comes from knowing you'll never simply blend into a crowd. Rather than let it crush him, he leaned into humor early, using jokes and charm as armor, a survival skill that would later define his entire acting career. Still, the emotional residue of those years, the sense of having to constantly prove he belonged, stayed with him long after he became famous. At 14, he asked his parents to send him to a private boarding school outside his hometown, largely to get him into a more structured, disciplined environment and away from the rougher edges of his neighborhood. It was a formative decision, one that pointed him toward a very different life than the one many of his childhood friends ended up living. Before Hollywood ever entered the picture, DeVito trained and worked as a hairdresser, following his older sister into the beauty business. He was good at it, dedicated to the craft, and by his own account never imagined that his path would eventually lead to a stage or a film set. Acting found him almost by accident, through a chance suggestion from someone connected to the theater world, and once he tried it, something shifted. He auditioned for a dramatic arts program on a whim and, despite having no formal training, impressed the people evaluating him enough to be offered a place. It was during those early years in New York, chasing small roles and barely making rent, that DeVito formed one of the most important relationships of his life. Not romantic, but a deep and lasting friendship with a young actor named Michael Douglas, who happened to be his roommate. Neither of them had much money. Both were struggling to get noticed, but they supported each other through years of rejection, and that loyalty would eventually change DeVito's entire career, since it was Douglas, years later, who helped bring him into the cast of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the film that first put DeVito on the map as a serious screen presence. The years leading up to that breakthrough were genuinely difficult. Like most working actors, DeVito faced far more rejection than success, cycling through odd jobs to make ends meet while continuing to chase small parts. It's a familiar story in show business, but for someone whose physical appearance already made him stand out from the traditional leading man mold, the rejection carried an extra sting, a quiet, persistent question of whether Hollywood would ever have real room for someone who looked like him. DeVito's first major wave of fame came through television, in a role that seemed like an enormous gamble at the time. He left behind steady film work to audition for a sitcom about New York cab drivers, playing a dispatcher named Louis De Palma, who was rude, manipulative, and almost impossible to like on paper. Many people around him, including people in the industry, questioned the decision. Switching from film to television in that era was often seen as a step backward for a rising actor. The gamble paid off in a way nobody fully predicted. Louis De Palma became one of the most talked-about characters on television, a supporting player so vivid and specific that DeVito walked away with major industry awards for the role, including an Emmy and a Golden Globe. It was proof of something DeVito would go on to demonstrate again and again throughout his career. Audiences didn't need a character to be likable to be unforgettable, and DeVito had an extraordinary gift for making difficult, even unpleasant characters feel utterly human. It was also during this period of his career that he met Rhea Perlman, an actress who would go on to become his wife, his creative partner, and one of the most consistent presences in his life for the next several decades. Their connection was immediate, and Perlman was eventually cast in the same show, playing a character who, on screen, was paired with DeVito's. Off-screen, their relationship deepened quickly, and they were married in the early. Together they had 3 children, and for years their partnership, both personal and professional, looked like one of the more stable, enduring relationships in an industry known for the opposite. Once his television show ended, DeVito did something that many actors making that same transition struggle to accomplish. He built an entire second career in film, not just as a character actor picking up small supporting roles, but as someone capable of anchoring big studio productions. He appeared in acclaimed dramas, high-grossing action comedies, and eventually took the kind of gamble that could have ended his career instantly. Starring opposite Arnold Schwarzenegger in a film built entirely around the joke that the two of them, wildly mismatched in size and appearance, were supposed to be long-lost twin brothers. It could have been a disaster. Instead, it became a massive box office hit and reshaped how the industry saw DeVito. He wasn't just a scene-stealing supporting actor anymore. He was proof that a leading man didn't need to fit any conventional mold to carry an audience's attention for an entire film. From there, DeVito expanded his ambitions even further, stepping behind the camera to direct feature films with a distinct, darkly comic sensibility. He also took on more villainous, physically transformative roles, most memorably playing a grotesque, tragic version of a classic comic book villain in a major studio blockbuster, a performance that required hours of makeup and a willingness to disappear completely into something unglamorous and strange. While his acting career was thriving publicly, DeVito was also quietly building something that would leave an enormous mark on American film history behind the scenes. Alongside creative partners, he founded a production company that took chances on scripts other studios wouldn't touch. That company played a pivotal role in getting an unconventional, boundary-pushing crime film made when other studios had already passed on it, a film that would go on to become one of the most influential movies of its decade and help launch or revitalize the careers of everyone involved. The same production company backed a beloved family film adaptation of a children's novel, one that DeVito personally directed and starred in alongside Perlman, playing an exaggeratedly awful father figure. Off-screen, cast and crew members have spoken warmly over the years about how genuinely caring DeVito and Perlman were toward the young star of that film during a difficult period in her personal life. A small but telling detail about who DeVito actually is behind the larger-than-life characters he plays. For all his outward success, DeVito's physical condition never fully went away, and in many ways it worsened as he aged. The joint pain associated with his bone disorder is progressive, meaning it tends to intensify over the decades rather than improve. Hips, knees, and his back have all been persistent sources of discomfort throughout much of his adult life, made worse by decades of physically demanding roles, including plenty of his own stunt work. He has spoken publicly, though not often, about the reality of working through pain, about mornings that start with physical therapy just to get his body ready to function for the day, and about the discipline required to keep showing up on set decade after decade, despite a body that was never going to make it easy. It's the kind of ongoing, invisible struggle that rarely gets discussed in profiles focused on his box office numbers or his one-liners, but it has quietly shaped nearly every year of his working life. Even in his later career, taking on a demanding, physical comedic role on a long-running cable sitcom well into his 60s and 70s, DeVito continued pushing his body in ways that would be unreasonable for most people his age, let alone someone managing a chronic bone and joint condition. Colleagues and interviewers have noted his remarkable stamina and commitment, but that stamina has come at a real physical cost that he has largely chosen to absorb privately rather than turn into a public narrative about suffering. Perhaps the most quietly heartbreaking part of DeVito's later life involves his decades-long relationship with Rhea Perlman. After roughly 30 years of marriage, the couple separated, a split that surprised many people who had watched them build both a family and a shared creative legacy together over the years. Reports at the time pointed to the strain of DeVito's demanding schedule and rumors about his personal life, though neither DeVito nor Perlman ever spoke about the details of their split with much specificity. What makes the story particularly poignant is what happened afterward. The two attempted to reconcile at least once, spending time together again and, for a period, appearing to have found their way back to each other. But the relationship ultimately didn't hold, and they separated for good after several more years. And yet, remarkably, they never went through with an actual divorce. Instead of a courtroom battle over decades of shared assets and history, they quietly worked out how to divide their life together privately, choosing to preserve whatever was left of their bond rather than let lawyers finish what time had already started to unravel. In the years since, DeVito and Perlman have continued to live near one another and stay in regular contact, a friendship built on the wreckage of a marriage that neither of them seemed fully willing to let go of. Family members have described a relationship that looks, from the outside, almost like a version of marriage without the legal paperwork. Two people who built an entire life together and, even after everything fell apart, couldn't quite bring themselves to walk away completely. There's something deeply sad about that kind of ending. A love that outlasted the marriage itself, but never found a way back to what it used to be. Even now, in his 80s, DeVito hasn't slowed down the way many actors his age eventually do. He has continued acting, continued producing, and continued showing up to work despite a body that, by his own account, has been fighting him since childhood. He has used his platform occasionally to speak about living with the chronic condition, hoping that more visibility might help other people quietly dealing with similar disorders feel less alone, even though he has generally preferred to let his work speak louder than his personal struggles. There's an undeniable sadness to the full picture of Danny DeVito's life once you look past the loud, larger-than-life characters that made him famous. A childhood spent feeling physically different in a world built for average-sized bodies. A body that has caused him near-constant discomfort for most of his adult life. Hidden behind decades of energetic, physical performances. A marriage that fractured and never healed, yet never fully ended either, leaving him bonded for life to someone he could build a family with, but ultimately couldn't stay married to. None of it fits neatly into the image of the confident, scene-stealing performer audiences think they know. And yet, there's also something quietly admirable buried in all of that sadness. DeVito never let any of it stop him. He turned a body that made him an outsider as a child into one of the most iconic screen presences of his generation. He turned decades of physical pain into a work ethic that outlasted actors half his age. And he turned the collapse of his marriage into something gentler than most divorces ever managed to become. An ongoing, imperfect friendship instead of a clean break. It isn't the fairy tale ending most people hope for, but it's honest, and in its own complicated way. It says a lot about who Danny DeVito really is once the cameras stop rolling. By the middle of DeVito's film career had already spanned decades, and most actors in his position would have started easing into smaller, occasional roles. Instead, he found an entirely new audience by joining the cast of a scrappy, low-budget cable comedy about a group of deeply flawed friends running a rundown bar in Philadelphia. The show's creators had built a small but devoted following without him, and bringing in an actor of DeVito's stature was, at the time, considered a significant risk for a series still finding its footing. Network executives reportedly worried that adding someone so recognizable might overshadow the show's original cast or change its scrappy tone entirely. It didn't. Instead, DeVito folded seamlessly into the ensemble, playing a character just as morally bankrupt and gleefully self-interested as anyone else on the show. He committed fully to some of the most physically and emotionally unhinged material of his entire career, embracing bizarre, uncomfortable, and occasionally genuinely dangerous physical comedy well into his 60s and 70s. Younger viewers who had never seen his earlier films discovered him for the first time through that role, and the show went on to become one of the longest-running live-action comedy series in American television history, anchored in large part by his willingness to commit completely, no matter how strange or physically demanding a scene became. That willingness came with a cost that rarely made headlines. Behind the scenes, DeVito has acknowledged that the physical toll of the show's more extreme stunts and gags was significant, particularly given his underlying joint condition. Where a younger, taller actor might walk away from a rough scene with some bruising, DeVito's body, already compromised by decades of joint deterioration, often needed considerably longer to recover. He rarely made that struggle public, choosing instead to let the finished scenes speak for themselves, while quietly managing the aftermath in private. What makes DeVito's story so compelling, and so quietly sad, is how much contradiction sits at its center. He is one of the most successful actors of his generation, yet his defining career move, leaving film for a television gamble that could have ended everything, was made at a moment when most people around him were telling him it was a mistake. He built one of the most influential independent production companies of the, helping bring bold, unconventional films to life that major studios wouldn't touch, yet he rarely takes credit publicly for that side of his legacy, letting directors and stars he helped launch receive most of the spotlight. He built a family and a decades-long partnership with Rhea Perlman that, by any reasonable definition, didn't survive as a marriage, and yet somehow never fully ended either. Friends and family have described their bond in the years since as something rarer than either a clean divorce or a reunited couple, a relationship that simply refused to resolve itself neatly, staying suspended somewhere between love and loss for years on end. It is, in its own way, one of the more honest outcomes two people who spent 30 years together could have landed on, even if it isn't the ending anyone would have scripted for them. And running beneath all of it, quietly, is a body that has never given him an easy day. Every leap onto a bar counter, every pratfall, every physically demanding stunt he insisted on doing himself, came at a cost that most audiences never saw and that DeVito rarely spoke about directly. He built an entire career on physical comedy using a body that consistently punished him for it, and he kept doing it anyway, film after film, season after season, well past the point when most performers would have scaled back. At 80, Danny DeVito is still working, still occasionally surprising audiences, and still carrying the same quiet mix of humor and pain that has defined his entire life. Behind every unforgettable performance was a man managing chronic discomfort most fans never knew about, chasing a career that almost never happened, and holding on to a relationship that time and circumstance broke apart, but somehow never fully erased. That, more than any single role or award, might be the truest measure of his story. What do you think has been the hardest part of Danny DeVito's journey? The physical pain he's carried since childhood, or the marriage that never quite let go? Share your thoughts in the comments.